Hello and welcome to the second part of how plants make macromolecules. Continuing from where we left off, we had talked about plants being able to make carbohydrates, but plants do not just make carbohydrates. As we said, they make lipids, nucleic acids, and proteins as well. Along with carbohydrates, these are the four macromolecules that organisms need to live. They are sometimes called the four biomolecules because they are that important to life. Bio referring to life. The second macromolecule we'll be talking about, the first of course was carbohydrates, is lipids. Plants make many kinds of lipids, and there's a few that you will definitely be familiar with. One is oils, and oils are, there's a variety of oils. One is olive oil. Squeezed from olives, we use it in salad dressings and a variety of things. It is actually liquid at room temperature. And waxes, which are another type of lipid made by plants, and they are actually solid at room temperature. But a commonality between the both are the fact that they hate water, which is a characteristic that all lipids have. Lipids are what are called hydrophobic because they have a phobia or a hatred of water. They will not interact with water. This can actually be seen by this graphic right here, where you see the water and the oil totally separated from one another. This hydrophobicity that waxes and oil share are used by plants. In this case, the plants are actually covering their leaves with a waxy substance to prevent water loss and or prevents water from entering the leaf. Plants will use oils and waxes for a variety of reasons, such as waterproofing their leaves, as I just showed, storing energy. They will use them to send messages around the plant, so for communication. In science, we call those hormones. And they will be used in the membranes of cells. You should be asking yourself, though, where do these lipids come from? I mean, we saw that in photosynthesis, you take CO2 and water, and you use the sun's energy to reconstruct those atoms. So the atoms come apart. Those atoms kind of float in like a limbo for a second, and then they are reoriented as sugar and oxygen. So here's the sugar. Where's the lipid? So it's true that only sugars are being able to be made during photosynthesis, but it's the atoms of those sugars that can be used to later build lipids. Now, visible right here is a lipid. The lipid is extremely similar in appearance as a carbohydrate in the ways that they both have the same atoms within them. You'll see that the white hydrogens, you can see that this is peppered throughout the lipid here. It's also in the carbohydrate. You can also see the carbons. This is like a true backbone. Remember, it's an organic molecule, so it has that carbon backbone. This one does too. There's a carbon ring. And you can see the oxygens right here, concentrated at the top, or the very right of the lipid. And you can see that the oxygens are throughout the carbohydrate. So these are two very different macromolecules. One is hydrophobic, one is hydrophilic, one is used in candy, the other is used in salad dressing, yet they are made from the same kinds of atoms. So the tree is taking the atoms that were previously found in carbohydrates and rearranging them to make lipids. So you take the carbohydrate, break the bonds, and reorient them to make the lipid. And with that, you go from something sweet to something oily. Moving on to macromolecule number 3, first being carbohydrates, the second being lipids. We are now at nucleic acids. So nucleic acids are made by plants, and the one you will probably be familiar with is a type of nucleic acid called DNA. DNA allows the tree's cells to multiply without any problems, any errors. The DNA allows the tree to pass its genes on to the next generation, and by generation I mean the babies. So DNA allows the parents' genes to be passed to the babies, the next generation, so the babies can live just as well as the parents did. Also, the DNA holds critical information, so each cell can function properly. So once again, you should be asking yourself, much like with lipids, photosynthesis makes sugars, so where did these nucleic acids come from? And much like with making lipids, nucleic acids are made partially from sugars, but the process from going carbohydrate to nucleic acids is not as straightforward as just rearranging the atoms as was done in the creation of lipids. So, sorry, it's not as easy as with lipids, but the process isn't going to be too difficult for you to wrap your mind around. As you can see here, carbohydrates have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, as do the nucleic acids. This is another model of nucleic acid. But there are some interesting colors showing up. There are some blues and yellows. Photosynthesis was able to add 3 of the 5 atoms needed to make a nucleic acid. But we additionally have nitrogen and phosphorus now. So the question is, where did the nitrogen and phosphorus come from? If they don't come from photosynthesis, and they are necessary in order to construct a nucleic acid, if not taken for photosynthesis, where are these new atoms coming from in order to build a nucleic acid? Well, nitrogen actually comes from the air. You can see here a tremendous picture of our atmosphere. Okay, so the atmosphere on that global picture is 78% nitrogen. 21% of the air is oxygen, so sufficiently less than nitrogen, and then 1% is a bunch of other things, including argon, water vapor, carbon dioxide, and some other trace gases. So how does the nitrogen get into the plant so it can then be used to build nucleic acids? Well, you have to refer to the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle is something we will discuss later in the year, but essentially, nitrogen is not useful as a gas. So it needs to be taken from the air, and it can rain down as raindrops if the nitrogen dissolves into the water. During thunderstorms, lightning we'll talk about actually can help convert that nitrogen into a useful form. But most of the times, certain plants have these bacteria that can actually take in the nitrogen and turn it into a form that's usable. Then the bacteria will trade that nitrogen to the plant, which the plant needs. Remember, it's needed for DNA construction and other nucleic acids. The bacteria will trade that nitrogen for sugars. So carbohydrates for nucleic acids, essentially. It's from here that a animal can get that nitrogen needed for its nucleic acids by consuming the plant. And then the cow dies, and it's another type of bacteria that will either consume the poo of the cow or the dead body of the cow and send that nitrogen back into the air. And the process cycles, hence the name nitrogen cycle. The phosphorus is slightly different but it's the same kind of idea. It is involved with a more or less a cycle, which is a little harder to understand, so we're not going to once again get into it right now. We'll get into it later. But essentially, rocks will break down, releasing phosphorus. From there, those particles can actually be taken up through the plant's roots, and that's how you actually get phosphorus into the plant. And if you're going to continue with the phosphorus cycle, the animals can then get phosphorus from the plants, but we're not going to, like I said, get into that. But that is where we are getting our nitrogen and our phosphorus from, to actually construct these nucleic acids. So plants use the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen from sugars, along with the phosphorus from the rocks and nitrogen from the air, to build nucleic acids. Now to concentrate on the structure of a nucleic acid. Nucleic acids are actually made of many single units joined together, and together they construct nucleic acids. This is not uncommon for macromolecules to be made from smaller subunits. So they use a term when you have these single subunits coming together, and the single subunits are called monomers. So here are 3 monomers. And those monomers will connect to one another to make a larger structure called a polymer. So this is an obvious similarity to Legos, so they're often used as the analogy. So you can think of a bunch of monomers like single Legos, just kind of lying about, and then once they are connected, a process called polymerization, you build a polymer. So monomers come together to make polymers. Going away from the Lego analogy, a real world example is actually carbohydrates. Their monomer being a monosaccharide and their polymer being a polysaccharide. So this is just to reinforce the idea of, once again, macromolecules tend to have monomers and polymers, and it's not just nucleic acids. But getting back to nucleic acids directly, they have their own monomer, and it is called a nucleotide. And its monomer looks complex, but I'm just showing you this so you can see all the atoms are present. Carbon and oxygen. There's carbon, there's a bunch of oxygens, you get the hydrogens, there's nitrogens, and phosphorus is right there. Here is a substitute for that other drawing, with this being a easier thing to understand, but I'm highlighting what parts are supposed to represent what. Okay, so this is the general structure that we'll be using to represent a nucleotide, because this one's a little more complex. By combining nucleotides, you can create nucleic acids. So this nucleotide will combine with another nucleotide, and maybe even another nucleotide, to create a nucleic acid, which is the polymer. So we have 3 monomers connected to now create a polymer. And hopefully you're appreciating the fact that the polymers of nucleic acids are actually called nucleic acids, so you don't have to remember any new vocabulary there. Finally, we are at the last macromolecule. We have gone through 3 already: carbohydrates, nucleic acids, lipids, and now the 4th one here is protein. Plants make many proteins, many proteins, and plants use them in similar ways as animals use proteins, and that is, plants and animals use proteins to do things like reinforce their bodies, to make chemical messengers, and they have a variety of uses in the cells of the actual plant, such as they are enzymes, which help speed up chemical reactions, and they are cell receptors, which help cells interact with the external environment and even touch other cells, and just a bunch of different stuff that it's so many things that we just won't get into them right now. So moving on to just, where are these proteins coming from? These very important proteins that plants use. Well, once again, 3 of the 5 atoms that are needed for proteins, you can actually see them right here. They once again can originate as sugars, and we know that the nitrogen that is actually also present in proteins came from the air, but there is this other atom which has not been accounted for up to this point. The atom is sulfur, and the big question is now, where is this sulfur coming from? Since it didn't just come from photosynthesis, it didn't come from the air, so where's sulfur coming from? The answer to that is sulfur, similar to phosphorus, is coming from the rocks, but similar to nitrogen, it actually is coming from the air as well, in something we call the sulfur cycle, which we'll once again discuss later in the year. But the sulfur can come from the rocks and be taken up by the roots, or the sulfur in the air can come down as raindrops and the plants can drink those compounds essentially. So now that we know where all the atoms are coming from, let's get into this whole monomer polymer thing again, which proteins are also part of. Proteins, their monomer is actually an amino acid, and that is what you are viewing right here. This is just one Lego piece, in essence. It's just the monomer. So just one of these is not necessarily a protein. You're going to need a number of those attached to each other like Lego pieces to make the protein. There are 20 different amino acids used by living things, which of course includes the trees, and this is just one of them. This particular amino acid and the way it looks is called cysteine. And cysteine is an amino acid that contains sulfur, but not actually all amino acids need that sulfur, so that's just something to kind of keep in mind. So all the amino acids are pretty identical looking, except certain ones have different things, such as cysteine needing that sulfur. This is a different version of that same amino acid, but I just kind of think that this one's a little confusing. So why don't we just use this one right here? So we'd have the nitrogens, and here's the carbons, right? It's an organic molecule, so you gotta have the carbon. Here's that sulfur right there. And so the amino acid is once again the monomer, which links together with other amino acids to become a polymer of protein. The polymer of a protein can be called a few things depending on, the protein's length, so how many amino acids is in the protein, and these can be very, very big, and also its functionality, so if it's working or not working. And those names include, you have protein, a peptide, and a polypeptide. So much like nucleic acids, the polymer of a protein is actually sometimes called a protein, but additionally, and unlike nucleic acids, proteins have some additional names, as you see here. So this is a protein, and since it's actually only 3 amino acids long, the type of protein it is a peptide. So shorter proteins are called peptides, and each color is supposed to be one of those amino acids coming together. So, same thing as in the case of nucleic acids, as in the case of carbohydrates. We have these monomers click together, and they become now the polymer, called a protein, and specifically a short protein, which is called a peptide. So hopefully after these 2 videos you have a better idea of how macromolecules are actually constructed and how their differences in atoms require different processes additional to just photosynthesis itself, and how rearranging atoms and gathering atoms from the soil or rocks or the air can allow organisms to build all 4 macromolecules, lipids, nucleic acids, proteins, and carbohydrates.